Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for one of our many wonderful webinars in Earth Laws Month. I'm particularly excited today because our three guest speakers are people I both admire and am very good friends with. So it's quite lovely to have these lovely folks join us this morning. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to share screen and acknowledge country. So first, just a quick plug for Earth Laws Month. If you're new to the kinds of activities we've been up to, welcome. And the Australian Earth Laws Alliance is a small not-for-profit based in Australia. We have lots of friends and networks internationally, but a lot of our core work is here in the beautiful continent now known as Australia. And throughout September, in a crazy fiesta of online happiness, we set up almost 35 events across the whole month. We're halfway through. And as I say, I'm really excited to be talking about ecological law and governance this morning. If you haven't seen the program for Earth Laws Month, the website is up here. So it's our earthlaws.org.au, and either click on the button that says Earth Laws Month or continue typing ELM 2022. As I mentioned this morning, we've got wonderful guests from North America. Geoff Garver and Carla Spurt are in Canada, and Katie Guisden is in the US, and I'll be introducing them properly in just one moment. Oh, I think I'm this is my promotional plug for tomorrow's webinar. Don't forget to join tomorrow. We've got some amazing people who are sharing really some deep and important research about green extractivism and the Australian energy transition. So if you haven't registered for that one, remember all our events are free. So please do sign up and join us. But what I should have done before all of that is I'd like to acknowledge country. For those joining us who are not from Australia, it's an important tradition where folks acknowledge that we live in a colonised continent. So I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the beautiful lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples here in North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and emerging young leaders and elders who are caring for country and caring for each other. We always acknowledge the remarkable civilizational culture that has cared for this continent and managed and governed this continent since time immemorial, and the ongoing impacts of the colonial legacy. And the work we do in the Australian Earth Laws Alliance and in our sister groups, Future Dreaming and the New Economy Network Australia, we'd like to play our humble contribution, our humble part in breaking down and making clear the impacts of colonisation, so that we can all live on this continent and enjoy a beautiful future, even though that future looks very scary and changing many times. And on a personal note, this is a very beautiful photo that my good friend James Lee took for me of the water lilies at Nudgee Nunda, which is right nearby where I live, where I walk my dogs. Nudgee Nunda is the Aboriginal, the Turrbal word for black duck waterhole. So I invite you all to take a big deep breath and have a think about where you live, work and play, what it is about country that you love, whose country that you're on. And in Australia, it's becoming a bit of a Zoom tradition. Folks pop in the chat where they're from and whose country they're on. It's very nice for those of us to read where else everyone is. Just a reminder, that's the beautiful map of Aboriginal Australia, the system of governance that looked after this place long before the British Empire came along. All right, so that's the end of my introduction and my mini advert for Earth Laws Month. Ecological law and governance is becoming a framework and a paradigm shifting way of bringing a lot of the good stuff together. AILA started 10 years ago, particularly triggered by Earth jurisprudence, but also first laws and Aboriginal philosophy and law here in this country. And over the 10 years, we've been watching a whole range of amazing concepts and ideas emerge. And I was so pleased when many years ago now, I met Geoff Garver. He first introduced me to his work. Now some of these folks are part of creating the Ecological Law and Governance Association. So it's with great pleasure that today we'll have Geoff talk first, and then Carla, and then Katie. So I can't wait. And we'll have some Q&A at the end. And as always, if you've got questions as we go along, please pop them in the chat. And my lovely helper in the Earth Laws Centre, Christina Myers. Wave to Christina. Christina's a wonderful young lawyer working with us, and she'll be helping us today. And that is enough from me. So with great pleasure, I'll put the spotlight on Geoff. Over to you, Geoff.
Great. Well, thank you, Michelle. Hello tomorrow from yesterday here in the unceded indigenous lands in Georgia, also known as Montreal. This is the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, also known as the Mohawks, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I certainly honor the history that they have with this land that moves forward in this present situation, and hopefully towards a better future that can be inspired by some of the legal traditions and other traditions that they bring to the conversation here and elsewhere. So I am going to give you sort of an overview of ecological law, and especially focus on one of the projects I'm working on now, which is developing what we're calling ecological law case studies. And let's see here. Yeah, let me before I get into this, my relationship to ecological law goes back to when I started a law master's at McGill University in 2009, and I had discovered the world of ecological economics. And I said, well, what is the equivalent in law? And I found some very interesting things that were out there. I think Earth law may have already been coined. There was something called Earth jurisprudence, which had flowed out of the work of Thomas Berry and others. Cormac Cullinan had come up with the idea of wild law. And I decided to develop something called the rule of ecological law. And I since discovered that actually the thinking about this kind of law transitioned to a more earth-centered ecological framing of law goes back at least to Germany in the 1980s with Klaus Bosselmann's work at that time. Klaus is the chair of the ELGA, the Ecological Law and Governance association that Michelle, Katie, and I are all on the steering board of. So let me just give you an overview of what this idea of law, ecological law, is trying to respond to. So those of us who are working to develop ecological law share a concern that there were big problems with environmental law. And in 2016, a group of folks, I wasn't there, but I was certainly there in spirit, came up with something called the Oslo Manifesto. And one of the things that the group recognized was that environmental law is rooted in modern Western law with its origins in religious anthropocentrism. It was operating out of Cartesian thinking and Cartesian dualism between humans and nature, a strong emphasis on individualism and on utilitarianism. And we were realizing that in an ecological age where we're brushing up against limits like climate change, which is certainly not the only one, this worldview is outdated, and environmental law was also outdated. And yet it's part of a contemporary system of law that remains dominant. And a central idea here is that nature is perceived as the other. So this was kind of the core of the problem that we were trying to look at. And we recognized that what was needed was something that would respond by being more ecocentric, more holistic, and that would recognize intergenerational and interspecies justice. It would recognize ecological interdependencies and no longer favor humans over nature and individual rights over collective responsibilities. So what we're trying to do in a sense with ecological law is to internalize the natural living conditions of human existence and make them the basis of all law. In other words, look at how nature works and try to fit humans into that rather than the other way around. And certainly it casts doubt on our current system of property rights, human rights to the expense of the rest of nature, corporate rights, and so on. Well, I know that Carla is going to have more to say about the core principles, but when I did my work on developing this idea, here I came up with a list of features that for me is sort of a list I'm willing to amend over time. In fact, I have added the one here called use of biocapacity and extracted materials based on real needs, something that Carla, who you'll hear from a bit, really inspired me to include there. But key ideas is this is a form of law in which humans are recognized as part of Earth's life systems, not separate from them, that there needs to be primacy of ecological boundaries. So a full takeaway of this, and the next idea, which is full integration of ecological limits and rules and policy, is that ecological law doesn't just transform environmental law, it transforms all law, because it really has to come into things like corporate law or estate law or areas of the law where we might not even be thinking that there's an environmental connection. If you're taking a holistic integrated look, everything is part of an ecological outlook. So I'm not going to spend too much time on here because Carla is going to go into a little more depth on these. And she has very helpfully, I think, phrased these groupings of these features that I had come up in these three categories, which I, again, will let her explain in more detail: ecocentrism, ecological primacy, and ecological justice. And this chart really just shows an overview of how environmental law differs from an ecological law, or how ecological would transform contemporary law in terms of the human nature relationship, in terms of the kinds of limits that were ecological and environmental limits, and how we use them in our legal systems, how law mediates the use of materials and energy. A big idea here is moving from efficiency, which studies show actually increases the use of the thing you're using more efficiently. That's the tendency. So the idea is to work towards sufficiency. Different notions of scale. So ecological law would certainly change the role of state sovereignty, and be more open to having rules that transcend state sovereignty when they're needed, with things, for example, with things like climate change. Different notions of fairness, less reliance on markets to determine fairness, at least implicitly. That's pretty much how things work now, and greater attention again to interhuman, interspecies, and intergenerational fairness. And then all of this means there's a different system of researching, monitoring, and making adaptations in the legal system. So again, I think Carla's going to go into a little more depth on all of that. But so let me turn to this idea of ecological law case studies. So one of the concerns that I and others had is that a lot of this work on ecological law is very theoretical. So how can we make it tangible? How can we give it some concreteness so that people can understand what it means in terms of real world situations? So these are based on real world situations. They can be an extractivist project. They could be a policy project. They could be a sectoral feature, and I'll give you some examples later to make more sense of that. But the idea is to deconstruct that situation, to identify all the legal and policy features of it, both indirect and direct and indirect, and at all governance levels. So this involves kind of brainstorming, like what is the legal and policy world that makes this situation possible? Then analyzing that against principles of ecological law, and then reconstructing the situation in a way that would be consistent with the regime of ecological law. Why would we want to do this? Well, again, to help define, to show how concretely how ecological law transforms all law, not just environmental law, but also to help define ecological law. By doing these case studies and ground testing some of the theoretical concepts, we can make adjustments in them that will make the idea of ecological law and its concepts more coherent. Also, to make clear the deep inadequacy of the status quo and the nature of the obstacles to overcome. So a lot of these reconstructions are going to seem pretty hard to achieve. So in that sense, we also want to highlight transitional reforms in the direction of a pure version of what ecological law might imply for each of those situations. So ultimately, altogether, this hopefully will illustrate a clear vision of ecological law on the ground. And this graphic just gives you a summary view of what we're talking about. So deconstructing, again, not just looking at environmental law, but all these other areas of law, doing some kind of analysis. And Carla has developed a wonderful tool called the lens of ecological law. I've done some work in developing what I call lock-in, lockout assessments to try and identify obstacles that either impede ecological law from getting implemented or so the good things we want to come in are blocked out, and the things that we want to remove are kind of locked in. So it's a way of approaching that. And then with this reconstruction, just to make this more tangible, we're thinking of these, that it's useful to have both a transitional description of the scenario and a final, more idealistic one. Some of the analytical tools you'll hear again from about the lens of ecological law, lock-in, lockout assessments that I've developed. Much of the work could use some of these emerging scientific paradigms of planetary boundaries for safe space for humanity, ecological footprint, donut economics and ecological economics methods could be applied here. And if these were done in certain ways, and in fact, you'll see in one case, it is going in this direction, these could be done with a lot of community and stakeholder consultations and interviews with all kinds of different kinds of knowledge holders. Certainly this invites interdisciplinary approaches. The idea here is to let study teams have the freedom to innovate. A lot of the background and the tools that we're thinking about are in these two books that Carla and I wrote. Let me give you some quick illustrations. So outside of Montreal, at the intersection of two highways, is basically an open air mall that the developers called Canada's first lifestyle center. Don't you just want to go move there? Well, in fact, it's name brand stores, an entertainment complex, which is really a movie theater that can be used for other things. It's a consumer heaven, and it's very highly reliant on cars. So it's a commercial lifestyle center located in Quebec, designed to emulate an urban or downtown shopping experience with boutiques and to meet the needs of suburban dwellers living on the South Shore of Montreal. In other words, recreate the city so that they don't have to actually create one. They can live in their suburban fantasy and build on that. Of course, there's a certain worldview at the bottom of this. There's a certain conception of the human-Earth relationship and a vision of the future that's involved here. And it's very much one that ecological law would be trying to reshape and transform. Yeah, the lifestyle, shopping, consumerism, global brands. What kind of labor is involved in providing this kind of a lifestyle center and so on? And again, very high dependence. This is a great example in which you can look at the difference between true needs of the people, people in general, and the utilitarian desires that this kind of a project is meant to appeal to. Of course, there are implications at all relevant levels: global, national, Quebec, local, regional, and this as well is certainly on traditional Indigenous land, so that would come in as well. What does this say about land use? Well, a lot of this land has involved conversion of really good farmland for suburban development, and it's situated at the intersection of two auto routes. Certainly, it would implicate, in terms of ecological limits, several planetary boundaries, climate change, land use, biodiversity. The western chorus frog is an endangered amphibian that lives in this area. Another example is the Kinzua Dam, which was built in the 1960s, flooding a huge portion of the reservation and the formal reservation plus traditional territory of the Seneca Nation, which is also part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in this part of the world. So it involved the breaching of a treaty signed by George Washington, the first U.S. President. It involved the condemnation of a third of the Seneca Reservation. The courts said this was okay to do under the power of eminent domain of the United States. So it calls into how sovereignty is used in this kind of a situation. And it's had all kinds of social and negative social and environmental side effects, especially for the Seneca Nation. How it calls into question whether, how the human-Earth relationship, the Seneca Nation is could be a model of a reconnection to place, or a way to reconsider the urban-rural relationship. A lot of the sacrifice of their land was done to promote the development of industrial development of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is something that can also give us a specific context in which to think of material and energy throughput, the consideration of true need of people in relationship to the earth, subsidiarity, the local control in this case was conceded to the a national perspective on the greater common good, which was provide electricity and flood control for Pittsburgh. What notions, how can we rethink notions of fairness and justice and so on? This is a great film about that story. I'll hop through these pretty quickly because I think I'm nearing the end of my time. Just to give you a sense of some of the other ones, and you could just note this YouTube. I invite you to look at the update on these. One of them is looking at restoring the river Ethiopian in Nigeria. This is heavily oil, a place of heavy oil development, and this river has really taken the brunt of it. So the idea is to recreate the river Ethiopia as a center, as a lifeblood of that region in a way that it used to be seen. And part of the effort there is to create rights of nature for that river, as in the Whanganui River in New Zealand. Many of you are probably familiar with the St. Lawrence Seaway. This is kind of a sister case to the Kinzua Dam. So the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, the Mohawks of Ganawage, which is a reserve near Montreal, had their they were cut off from the St. Lawrence River, a very, very central part of their life and their culture, by the building of the seaway that serves to connect North American producers of grain, steel, and so on with markets in Europe. And so the problem here is you can't really get rid of that seaway. So how can ecological law deal with questions of healing and reparations for this kind of irretrievable loss and harm? We have kind of a more traditional project, a proposed phosphate mining project in Brazil. This has strong links, among other things, to planetary boundaries, to trade regimes. The planetary boundaries for phosphorus, for example, a fossil mineral that is, researchers say, has already crossed a planetary boundary. A look at how ecological law would apply to maintaining marine biodiversity on the high seas in ways much different than is actually happening in this treaty that is not even being achieved. In this case in Vermont, looking at the saga of Pete the Moose, I won't tell the whole story, but really this illustrates how every single way you could look at this strange animal who got domesticated and was also wild, but not really, was always through a property lens. And so it calls into question that way of thinking about our fellow creatures on this planet. Carl and I have taken a look at applying the lens of ecological law to the replacement of the North American Free Trade Agreement, a pretty awful agreement from the perspective of ecological law. And we've tried to, we've applied the lens, and then the question now is, how would you reconstruct something like this? So concrete examples do exist. That's what we're learning from these cases. So I think we're seeing some success. Economic growth, state sovereignty, private property interest, and wealth accumulation are big problems in many of these. The dominant legal systems are profoundly anthropocentric. International regimes for protecting parts of Earth's ecosystems may have overarching goals of maintaining access to and use of ecosystems, generally to support growth and wealth accumulation. In other words, in ways that would be inconsistent with ecological law. There's a lot of the story of colonial legacies of land and resource grabbing here, both effects of that in the past and ongoing examples. Enduring harms from major disruptions of a local ecosystem. And then rights of nature and strong implementation of the Paris Accord are emerging as possible ways to lead in the direction of ecological law. We're hoping to publish a book, including, if I can get my buddy Michelle to, and I think she'll come through, develop a chapter looking at some of the work she's doing on green prints or other Earth law case studies in Australia. And then this is just part of a bigger set of efforts. So we want to do a workshop eventually, and hopefully we could include some of you in that to spread the idea of doing these case studies and doing other kinds of outreach. And in a much broader picture, this is work that supports the broader missions of the Oslo Manifesto and ELGA, hopefully resonates with the rights of nature movement and with developments in ecological economics and degrowth. And if you get this slide, here's a whole bunch of good books on this topic. And that's what I have. I hope I didn't go too long there, folks.
No, you did great, Geoff. Thank you very much. Very exciting. And I am super keen to finish my chapter for you about the Green Prince approach and how wonderful communities around Australia who are grappling with many different issues can bring it all together, and how that's a fantastic example of moving beyond economic bullshit and focusing on the health of the earth. So that's great. Thank you, Geoff. And we'll have some questions and discussions in a moment. So I will quite literally take you off spotlight, and it's my great pleasure now to introduce Carla. Carla, please do introduce yourself. I know folks wear so many different hats. These days, I'll let people introduce themselves in whatever way they would prefer. Oops, I've done the spotlights wrong. Oh no, it's worked. Sorry. All my buttons. Thank you. Over to you, Carla.
Hi, thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. I'll be very brief. I guess I'm originally from Mexico. I've lived in Canada for 20 plus years. I studied law in Mexico and briefly in the US, and have worked in a number of environmental law and policy jobs in the corporate world, government, and NGOs, and an international organization linked to the NAFTA, which is where I met Geoff. And when Geoff got all excited about ecological law, I was happy to be hearing all about it, and then that got me all excited about ecological law. And so I decided to do some research on that, and this is basically what I'll be sharing with you. And I have since moved to the tiny town of Danford Lake in southwestern Quebec, which is really the traditional territory of the Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe First Nation, unceded territory as well. And with my partner here, we're trying, I'm not sure how successfully, but we're certainly trying and learning to grow as much of our own food as possible. And so it's interesting, and it all kind of, I guess, lines up with change of world vision and trying to find a better relationship to the place where we live and the place that sustain us. So with that long introduction, sorry about that, I will share my screen. And greetings to everyone. Also, thank you so much, Michelle, for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be part of the Earth Loss Month, and also to share this great in such great company, and to remotely meet everyone that's here online. I'm having some trouble with my glasses, and I do rely a lot on notes so that I don't go on forever. So I'm sorry if I have to switch glasses and then I keep glancing at my paper. Sorry about that.
You do whatever you're going to do, Carla. We're happy to have you. Don't worry about anything.
Thank you. So as I was saying, Geoff's work on the rule of ecological law inspired me to try to answer the question of how actual laws compare to ecological law. So I was fascinated by all the theory of ecological law, but I wanted to know, okay, well, how do we know how far or how close we are, the laws that we have now compare, how far or close they are to ecological law. So the lens of ecological law, you're probably getting tired of seeing the picture of my book. Sorry about that. Oh, why can't I? Oh, sorry. I'm having trouble.
Yeah, if you can't.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, click on it. It's very deceptive. Yeah.
Sorry about that. So the lens of ecological law that I came up with is a tool to answer this question. It's an analytical tool to help understand, as I said, how far or close current laws are from ecological law, and also to help envision what a transition to ecological law would require. To create this lens, I didn't really invent anything. I built on the very rich foundational scholarship of ecological law, including the work of Klaus Wasselman regarding the principle of sustainability and the idea of ecological justice, the work of Cormac Cullinan on earth jurisprudence and wild laws that Geoff has already mentioned, and also on Geoff's features of the rule of ecological law that Geoff described or listed already in detail. And I drew out 3 interconnected principles that reflect one or several core values that are critical to ecological law as an alternative to environmental law. I'm not suggesting these are the only principles of ecological law, but I do think that focusing only on 3 makes the lens a better analytical tool. On the other hand, though, I mean, there is a lot packed into each one of the principles. So the first principle, ecocentrism, calls for recognizing and respecting the value of all beings and the interconnectedness among them, equitably promoting the interests of human and non-human members of the Earth community. This principle is relational and conceptual, centering on the law's underlying view and understanding of the human-Earth relationship. It speaks to the law's ability to support and promote a worldview in which humans are part of nature and not necessarily more important than other life. It aims to ensure decisions don't disregard ecological consequences and are not biased in favor of human short-term interests. Some specific questions one would ask in looking at a law under this principle are, for example, whether it recognizes the interconnectedness of all beings, whether it treats all beings as subjects rather than objects. And then the way that this principle may manifest in law is, for example, as rights of other beings, rights of nature, as human responsibilities to respect other beings, or as ecological human rights, which means human rights that are ecologically bounded. The second principle, ecological primacy, calls for ensuring that social and economic behavior and systems are ecologically bound, respecting planetary boundaries. This principle has a material focus. It focuses on whether a law is clear about priorities, in particular, whether the priority is to ensure human development is pursued without irreversibly impairing ecological integrity or crossing planetary boundaries. A few things to highlight here. There's a lot packed into this principle. First, the principle makes an explicit reference to planetary boundaries, and this is meant to underscore the need to consider ecological limits from the local ecosystem to the planetary level. But it also implies that legal system needs to incorporate the growing and evolving understanding of complex social ecological systems. So they also have to continually evolve and refine themselves. Also, this principle of ecological integrity is the reference point for constraints on human economic activities. And this is slightly complicated idea or controversial idea, ecological integrity. But it follows, in this principle, it follows Klaus Bosselmann's notion that maintaining ecological integrity is an overarching goal of ecological law, and also his definition of the principle of sustainability, which is the duty to protect and restore the integrity of the Earth's ecological systems. At the same time, the principle of ecological primacy incorporates this idea of ecological integrity. It does so conceiving ecological integrity as including humans, so not as pristine nature with no humans at all. And that's an important distinction that Geoff has written a lot about. Another important part of ecological primacy is the precautionary principle, the need to prevent harm and put the burden of proof on the side of prevention, essentially. In terms of the reach of this principle, it really targets social and economic behavior by individuals, groups, corporations, and other legal persons. So, for example, property, marketing, and consumer behavior. But it also is meant to focus on sectoral and systems behavior. So the mining sector or the financial sector, for example, would be interesting targets for analysis under this principle. This principle of ecological primacy may manifest in law as, for example, obligations and responsibilities linked to certain activities, like ecological restoration requirements, or required reductions of materials and energy, emissions limits, bans on certain activities, and land use change restrictions are some ways in which we could see ecological primacy come up in law. The third and last principle, ecological justice, calls for law to ensure equitable access to the Earth's sustaining capacity for present and future generations of humans and other beings, and avoid the inequitable allocation of environmental harms. The principle is relational, but in contrast to ecocentrism, it is relational in a practical and material way, aiming to translate respect for all beings into actual equitable access to the Earth's sustaining capacity. It means to serve as ethical grounding for decisions about equitable use of the capacity of the planet to sustain life, and for decisions about the fair distribution of wealth and about restraints on wealth. The basis for this principle is Bosselmann's concept of ecological justice, which adds interspecies equity to inter and intra-generational equity. The principle also reflects the idea of environmental justice, but expanded, the rights of all beings to live in clean, healthy, and safe environments. A key element of the principle of ecological justice is that in order for all beings to have access to what they need, humans should limit what we take based on what is sufficient to meet our real needs, rather than to satisfy wants. So this, Geoff mentioned this already, in actually applying and trying to develop this principle of ecological justice, I came to find that this idea of basic needs or true needs was really, really fundamental to ecological justice. Although because all the principles are interrelated, it also comes up sometimes when you're considering a law or considering it more conceptually the principle of ecological primacy. So ecological justice implies limits to wealth because the earth is not infinite. Some specific questions to ask of a particular law under this principle are, for example, is access for humans to so-called natural resources needs-based, especially when it comes to non-renewable resources or materials, and also when it comes to extractive processes that are extremely destructive. We really, we have to justify have to set a very high bar on serious destruction of any landscape based on essential needs, and even that may be questionable. I don't know, but that's the one of the key elements of this principle. Another question is, does the law promote sufficiency? Does it set limits to wealth? In terms of how the principle of ecological justice may manifest in law, we can think of, for example, mandated reuse and recycling, also prioritizing land use that, or land uses that provide sustenance to humans and to other species over large-scale extractive uses that deplete the land. We can think of ecological restoration requirements and, for example, redistributive tax regimes such as guaranteed minimum income programs, or also legal frameworks for ecological food systems, and so on. Okay, right. So these are the three principles that comprise the lens of ecological law. And I will say just a little bit about how this lens can be used, and a little bit, I'll share a few examples, but I won't go into too much detail. It would take me too long, sorry.
And
so,
also,
okay,
Carla,
so it's pretty...
Just being, sorry to interrupt, I'm just being aware of time, probably only a couple more minutes, and then we'll head over to Katie's turn, if that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know we could all talk about this stuff for hours. I could certainly listen to it for hours.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally.
Thank you.
So the lens, as I said, is conceived for analyzing legal norms. So the first step is to identify the norms that we want to critique. And importantly, as Geoff mentioned, these would include environmental law, but would not be limited to environmental law. So, for example, a mining law, a trade agreement, or the Paris Agreement, etc. A second step is to then spell out specific questions under each principle, depending on the specific case and the selected norms. And I already mentioned a few of the kinds of questions that we specifically would want to look at. But another example, under ecological primacy, if we're looking at the Paris Agreement, we would ask whether it recognizes planetary boundaries. And if we're looking at a mining law, perhaps we would be a little more interested on whether it prioritizes extraction over the needs of local communities under this same ecological primacy principle. And so then the third step is to consider the selected norms from the perspective of each of the principles with these specific questions. Again, depending on the case, you can look at provisions one by one, or you can group them. And then the last step is to look back at the results of the analysis under each principle and identify synergies between the current laws and ecological law, and the obstacles the current laws pose for a transition to ecological law. And I'm sorry, I forgot to switch the slide. But one can also take one further step. So, for example, from 3 case studies that I did on mining, looking at the Banman metal mining in El Salvador, proposed mining in Ontario, Ontario's Ring of Fire area, which has high levels of ecological integrity. And the 3rd case study was the rights of Mother Earth and BBDN in Bolivian law in the context of a major lithium project. So after I identified the main obstacles and opportunities for a transition to ecological law based on these 3 case studies, I also tried to imagine what an ecological law approach to mining would look like. And I proposed essentially that the mining from or that ecological law would require that mining prioritize the use of minerals to satisfy basic human needs, that if there is any new extraction, it would be only again for needs and accepted only exceptionally and with the strictest measures, that indigenous jurisdictions would be recognized, and that the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples and the participation of local communities would be a given for any of the mining activities. And also that no extraction would be allowed in areas that have high levels of ecological integrity or that are used for agriculture or water processing. So, provisioning. So just to finish, I want to stress that the lens of ecological law is a work in progress, and I hope that others use it and apply it. And I'm so happy that in the case studies, in some cases, the lens of ecological law has been used. And I really hope that it's a tool that evolves and is improved by others. And thank you so much for listening. And I really look forward to Katie and to the rest of the discussion and questions.
Thank you, Carla. Having you and Geoff speak one after the other is really helpful to be really considering the core principles and the case studies and how this stuff might work. We've got a couple of questions coming in, which is excellent. So thank you so much. We'll have a good yarn in a minute. And Katie, over to you, my dear. She's already on it. She's happening. Thank you, Katie.
Unmute. There we go. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle, for having us, for having this conversation. Michelle is one of those colleagues that when she calls, I answer, and that will be forever. And it's a good friendship and a good colleagueship. So I appreciate this so much. So what I'll be speaking on, well, you can see a little bit about myself. My main job is the executive director of a Center for Environmental Ethics and Law, an international NGO based out of DC. I also serve as the chair of the ethics specialist group for the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. And my predecessor was Klaus Bosselman. So with all the wonderful sites and foundational readings that Carla had just cited. And of course, he is our chair for the Ecological Law and Governance Association. And then I also teach as well. And I teach everything from international law to international business transactions, which was not my favorite course, but I taught it more, well, from my angle of, trade and development and colonialism, human rights law, climate law. And I'm teaching now a course on international humanitarian law, or the law of armed conflict, which has a lot of very uncomfortable parallels with our relationships with one another and the earth. So it's a real honor to be here today. I'll be talking about some of the ethical foundations of the ecological law and governance movement. Of course, I am not the owner of this movement, so this is just how I view it in response to some of the crises before us. I focus on governance, on systems of governance that help and that harm. And by IDing those that harm, then we can have a better idea of how to respond. I also focus on systems of governance that can create the kind of laws that we need, like rights of nature, but that also can allow those rights or those laws to be realized. For example, if you have beautiful, we see this in the human rights world all the time. If you have beautiful text, beautiful words, beautiful laws, even concrete laws, but you have one hostile administration, one apathetic administration, it will not be funded, it will not be enforced, it may be written away. So how can we address these governance issues for stability, consistency, expectations, all the things that those with the rule of law and society and governance care about, and care for life, right? For life. So relational ethics, the roots of ecological law and governance. So I'll give a little bit of a background of just how I interpret ethics so that we're kind of on the same page and you can see where I'm coming from, as well as IDing some of the major breakings to our foundation. And again, and it's not just to focus on the critical, but only by identifying that which harms us can we have a better idea of how to respond and move forward. And then we'll go through rooted ethics or rooted causes to a rooted ethics and some of the methodology, because ethics is not just principles, it's practice. In fact, some would say that's what's most important about ethics is the practice. And it's not just the practice of creating the laws or enforcing the laws or even acting towards one another. It's also the methodology of us, of those within the environmental movement. Which principles do we advance and and are they within sometimes, unfortunately, some of the systems that harm? And we'll unpack that a little bit as well. And I say that we have kind of a higher ethical duty as self-described carers of the earth and of one another in the future to promote systems for life, right, for sustainability. So we look at rooted cosmopolitanism as a methodology forward. Ubuntu, I switched it a little bit. Ubuntu is a legal and ethical principle from Southern Africa. And then the Relato methodology as a process forward. And those, it's because it's the local community work, it's now 60 to 90 images and messages and stories and people and identity. But I'll give you 5 or 6 of them. So in honor of our time. And then just a few conclusions forward. So the way that we understand ethics is the domain of inquiry into right and wrong behavior. And importantly, when responsibility attaches, right? So that is the foundation of the rule of law. That is the foundation of justice. If there is a harm, how is that harm healed? What is the remedy? What is the reparation? And in what methodology? Is it a Western notion of we took your land, here's some money? Or is it a truth and reconciliation? Let's get together in dialogue to discuss how to properly heal from a harm that has occurred. Environmental ethics, of course, just expands that inquiry into the entire community of life. And then governance is just all of us. It's the institutions that govern us, the people, but it's also the powers, the systems. For example, when I was asked, when Chile was building their constitution, which has now unfortunately been rejected, I was asked what would be the best thing that Chile could include in their constitution to protect life on Earth, right? And I think from an environmental lawyer, they were expecting species protections or even rights towards natures or ecosystem. And my response was strengthening anti-corruption principles. Can you imagine the changes to law and governance and protection if we got money out, if we got huge amounts of money that not just draft laws, create laws, that purchase laws, but also purchase their enforcement or lack of. So corruption I see as one of those cornerstone harms that we need to address if we hope to have any future towards ecological law and governance, which is for what? Life, flourishing life on this planet. We also understand that all policies, action and inaction has ethical underpinnings. This includes budgets. In fact, budgets are sometimes the clearest thing that a state or government or industry or corporation can show you of what they value. You follow a budget, you see exactly what their values and what their priorities are. So even budgets are descriptions of values. And then we look too just at this ethical evolution of justice towards an ecological jurisprudence as a response for unanswered harms. What we're doing now is not working. And I say that as a critique of all life on Earth and our systems of governments and society, and looking into the environmental movement as well. What we are doing is not working. And that's the origins of the ecological law and governance story. Environmental law, sectoral, anthropocentric, is not working. So how can we respond to that, transition out, and move towards something better? Our current model of state sovereignty and global governance is not sustainable. State sovereignty is not sustainable. In international law, the state is the power holder. They are the ones that control the treaties, the trade, the negotiations, the imbalance of power in global negotiations. It is a broken model. So how can we confront that? Sustainable development is not a path towards sustainability. Development model is not a path towards sustainability. The development model is rooted in colonialism, in predation, in extraction, in economy, in capitalism, in discrimination, in violence, in harm. How did we ever think a development model could be a path forward? Any economic system that creates the vast inequalities we live in today is a broken one. Dr. King gave us 3 evils: capitalism, racism, and militarism. Just to that last point, we have so much of our nation's budgets go towards military. How can we even hope to have the resources that climate change and our other crises require when so much goes towards just military? Any governance system that allows states to cause harm to other states without any type of accountability is a broken system. This is what we have now. This is the lack of extraterritoriality of domestic laws. This is emissions. This is lack of accounting of historic harms. We are free to harm other nations. This is the entire climate change story. We are free to harm other nations without accountability, without payment, even if you're working within this economic system, they're without remedy, without repair, without healing. Any social structure that allows the destructions of the foundations of life to occur for economic gain of the powerful few is a broken structure. So we have to turn away from the hyper-individualism, the hyper-competition that brought us here, the rising nationalism and xenophobia that prevents us from helping one another, reject those values, those models, those methodologies that brought us to today. And instead, and this is where we're kind of transitioning now to a response, embracing scientific geopolitical reality of our interdependence upon one another, upon the foundations of life, organic and inorganic. Seeing diversity as the strength that it is, that's when we will discuss in a moment rooted cosmopolitanism that allows evolution, allows flourishing, speaking truthfully in a time of intentional mistruths, intentional disinformation. We do not separate crises of conservation from crises of governance. How can we hope to conserve life with governance systems that are necrophiliac, right? That are harmful. We must live relationally. So let us extend Ubuntu, this concept of Ubuntu, to one another, to all life, to the community of states. I've just begun to expand a little bit this idea of a relational sovereignty. With Ubuntu, I exist because you exist. My identity is entangled up in your identity. I cannot exist separate from you. And we also can extend that to nature. We exist because nature exists. Our identities are entangled up in one another. A state is a state only because of other states. So if they held that basic reality, geopolitical reality, think of what could happen with responsibility and with harm. So we're moving away from the necrophilic systems to ones that embrace life, from death systems to life systems. If our governance structures, our underlying ethics are not livable, then and if our decisions are causing global crises that threaten all life on Earth, because that's where we are in existential crises, we must seek a way forward. So here's a few with our methodology and how we gather these principles of ethics that underlie our action forward, the people involved, and it's a living process. You know, there is no end state to this. So first of all, rooted cosmopolitanism, just to give a little bit of background into what that means, it's a response to the anonymity of global governance. We desire universalism because it makes us see how we're connected, right? But with universalism, you get these broad statements that try to apply to everybody, and because of that, they apply to nobody. It loses particularity, it loses story, it loses life. And so rooted cosmopolitanism is a response to that. It recognizes the value of the particular and the whole, the place of the particular in the whole, interdependence and unity in diverse relationships, that we don't need to lose our identity. I do like, for example, within the rights of nature movement, which I do have some criticisms of, just with any rights-based movement, to be honest, they name names, they name forests, they name rivers, they name trees. There's identity to their voice and to their movement, which I love, and we need more of that. This perspective also asks humanity to soften, if not realign, our ego and our actions, as we are not, of course, the center of the universe. Finding common ground, common humanity, we can't lose sight of the particular. And we must be committed to the local. To you, Michelle, I am committed to you, Geoff, to you, Carla. That is what creates and builds solidarity, the things that we talk about on the international scale. These very intimate relationships are where it's at, where our future is at. Just to go up quickly to the previous slide, just with Ubuntu, I already unpacked it a little bit with just the idea that my existence is because of your existence, right? It is entirely dependent on that. Attach that to life around us, the foundations of life, as well as state relationships as well. So now we'll get to the Relato methodology. So this is the part of my learning process, right? Of looking at what harms people and what they value, and why is there often a gap between what they value and what their reality is. And that's often because of governance systems. And that is hostile, apathetic, or absent governance systems. That is the common thread to every single one of our stories of harm. And each of these stories are real people, real harms, and often real lack of accountability, remedy, healing for those harms. So that's part of what we're trying to do. So here's just a little list of where we've been to date and moving forward. Michelle is helping us with the Gary Rise Relato in particular. It's a human rights, collective rights, nature's rights project with a community, a Black poor community in Northwest Indiana. And they have had a history of harm from, gosh, I would say, well, the steel industries there were steel industries that literally took our nation through 2 world wars. And then it has just continued with pollution. There was a white flight out, and the schools there, the poisons there, the public health crises there are just overwhelming, what we do to people. Ecofeminism in the MENA region. And then we also have an Uram Relato, which is specific to marble mining in Portugal, and the public health harms, in particular, water and air to the communities there and indigenous peoples there. So just a little bit of some of the principles that come out from these stories. Conservation management through social upliftment. Again, can't separate people from nature, okay? It's part of the same story. Touching the earth lightly. When women succeed, often in all of my work, it's women leaders, and especially in these local, extremely harmed communities, it's often women leaders and women grandmothers. It's also why when I look at the law of armed conflict, states to destabilize communities will often target women specifically. The Indiana Dunes Relato, we just saw a lot of power and politics as a daily obstacle to a better life forward for everyone involved. Protect vulnerable people, places, species. Importance of place, knowing your history, know your place in the world. They sit on 20% of the world's fresh water. And yet, because of environmental racism, such as the Gary community is actually located right near here, these people never have any connection to the environment around them. They don't. It's a survival thing. They're so busy. Their families are so busy surviving from even the school to prison pipeline. And then we're asking them to care about the environment. That's why we have to deal with these social crises as a whole to life crises. Jordan Relato focused a lot on reconciliation, but to heal fully all parties involved, even those that oppress are harmed people, those that oppress and the oppressors, it's an entire cycle of harm. The interdependence of all life, balance, echo peace, especially now with what's happening in the world, Ukraine and elsewhere. You know, Ukraine just showed us a light on a lot of harm happening elsewhere that is often ignored. And for a lot of times for racial reasons, harm that's been often ignored. But how can we when there's attention is brought to these conflicts, how can we bring further attention to the refugees, the food insecurity, the life purposes that are also attached? Human dignity is a central ecological value. This is Rio State Relato. I'm sorry, I have to go quickly through these. But we also need to understand nature isn't a positive story for everyone. You know, look at Puerto Rico right now. Not everyone has a romantic, you know, pink colored glasses of what nature is. Nature can harm, it can break families apart, it can kill, it can destroy homes. So we must have this ecological reconciliation as well of all of our relationships with nature and the power involved, and be honest about it, right? Understanding that what seem like very local problems are global problems. It's a symptom, it's a symbol of something much bigger. And again, women at the centerpiece for a lot of this. Success here in this one local community where they unionized, because the story of harm, the story of oppression, the story of colonialism is also very closely attached to the story of workers and unionizing, right? The powers of people to come together. They rescued my life, they rescued my citizenship through jobs that took care of the earth, through collectives, through programs. This is Gangjang Village, South Korea. Environmental security is national security. Right to exist, our sacred waters, our beliefs, our identity, our culture has a right to exist. Sacred Gurumbi, spaces, a right to exist, right? Let's stand with that basic foundational point, building global solidarity. And then Gary Rise, which is ongoing now, once a model of the public school system in the US, and this is now the reality of defunding poor, corrupt governance forward. So we're just starting this one as well. And highlighting the good of the people too. The strength of Gary is the people of Gary, the art, their stories. So just some conclusions. An ethical principle, applied care, climate change, refugees. Duties of justice are global. National boundaries are morally irrelevant. Moral duties do not stop at national boundaries. Ethical principle applied, giving material aid to those in need. Funding climate solutions. A lot out of Glasgow is a loss and damages mechanism. Every time you have a COP, where does conversation stop? Accountability for past harms, for historic harms. Who is that? The United States. Ethical principle applied, protecting the vulnerable, which is a core to any ecological, environmental, law and governance movement. Acting and acting with intent. Also, you see a lot of cases now of inaction. State inaction is action, right? And transition. I often speak of transition instead of revolution, because a lot of times with revolution, the people that are hurt are those that are most vulnerable, the poor, the hungry, not the privileged that are often calling for the revolution. So I always speak in terms of transition. Even if we understand a revolution is required, we have to also understand in the methodology too of who will be hurt, who's protected and who's not. And for us, do not perpetuate systems of harm in action, language, or methodology. Those are forests, not carbon sinks. You call them carbon sink, yes, you're part of the problem. You know, we have to be aware of what we say. I'll just put these up here. We can screenshot them or we can have them posted afterwards. But just overall conclusions of procedural ethics, substantive ethics, and importantly, always, and I'll end here, applied ethics. Do not ever separate our crises of life with our crises of governance. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Katie. I've had a number of people ask if they're able to see the slides in addition to having the recording later. So if each of you are happy to forward them to me, then we'd be really delighted to put them on our website so folks can have a look at them separately. So look, thank you so much. Yes, Walter has encapsulated it. 3 brilliant and enlightening presentations, 1,000 thank yous. Thank you, Walter, for putting the words that I needed. What I would like to do, we have a couple of questions. What I'd like to do is share screen with a really dodgy slide that I often use to try to show folks who are new to the Earth Laws world kind of how things fit together in Australia. And you'll laugh when you see it. It's very high tech. Please hold. And the reason I thought I'd bring it up, isn't it cute? It's terrible. It's an icon image with an umbrella, but it's actually kind of helpful because a lot of folks go, what's the difference between environmental law and earth jurisprudence and rights? So let me just take 1 minute to explain how I talk about this stuff when we talk with folks and do educational stuff in Australia, because then I'd like to come back to some of the questions people have asked and interlink these concepts. And it's just as much for me as anybody else, because we're all learning with these incredibly fast moving emerging legal activities built on what I would call ancient knowledge about this relationist ethos. So when I chat with folks who are brand new to this world, I kind of point out some of the stuff that Geoff introduced, that current environmental law allows significant harm. And it is literally tacked onto, I mean, the simplest way to put it is we've had more than 500 years of colonial law, which is property-based separation from nature, and environmental law emerged 50 years ago and has done some good. But then what's happened is the work we saw was earth jurisprudence. I came across that in 2008, which is linked to rights of nature, because back then we just had the Ecuadorian constitution. It's funny to remember that when AILA was formed 10 years ago, and I would talk about the rights of nature in the Ecuadorian constitution at Australian gatherings, I would get laughed at. I would get scoffed at by other lawyers, thinking it was this, you know, far away, imaginary, silly thing. And then New Zealand brought legal personhood for nature in 2017. And that really rammed home, I think, for much more conservative places, what Katie's been talking about, this relationship with the place, the living place, and how people are trying to bring that into the law. And of course, separately but connected, there's the entire ecocide movement. And I've only got ecological law there because I actually met Geoff and others and the ecological law ideas later. But my question, and so over here, what we have in Australia is quite separate, but now we're seeing a connecting point between Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks. But, you know, we've got, as Mary Graham and Anne Polina and Tyson Yonka-Porter and Ross Williams and other folks in our regenerative songlines movement, Indigenous elders and leaders talk about ancient first laws. The law comes from the land. The Aboriginal map of Australia shows exactly what Katie was talking about with that diversity. Lots of pockets of autonomous places interconnected. And Mary Graham and I are working on a book on the relationist ethos. She's outlining the Aboriginal philosophy. We're finally bringing her remarkable work together and going, what if Aussie society was built on this? And I'm going to be pestering you, Katie, for some further updates on your Relato work. And then very importantly in Australia, the law of obligation. Aboriginal people talk about this. Mary Graham says, not everyone would agree with her, but she refers to it as a pan-Aboriginal concept. every group, every community had different language and different ways to explain it. But at the end of the day, it wasn't a rights-based culture. It's about an obligation to place, an obligation to care. And now we're also seeing people like Anne Polina saying, well, if you're going to talk about legal personhood or rights of nature, maybe you should also be considering the idea that these rivers, these forests, these systems are our ancestral beings. And if you're going to push back into white fella colonial law, here's another way to frame that. So the reason I brought that together is I'd actually love to ask you, Geoff, and probably Geoff and Carla, this first question. When you see ecological law, and I really love the 3 principles that you bring in, Carla, summarizing, it makes it, I've actually been talking with some of the folks in my team that those 3 principles, building on Geoff's work as well, actually help us to look across a framework and go, is it earth-centered? Is it, So can I ask you, Geoff and Carla, when you look at this dodgy diagram, how do you see all of these things fitting together? Do you find, have you enveloped some of these concepts in your work? Or do you feel that ecological law goes further or in a different direction?
Yeah, I'm glad you put that up, because I have a slide that's sort of, it's a list of interrelated concepts, and it's something, it doesn't include all these, but it's at least some of these, and I like what you have here. So the idea, the broader idea of looking for ideas that resonate and pulling them together in some way, I think is right in tune with my thinking. I wanted to, I think this is building on something you said here. I put a note in the chat, and just let me expand a little, because I think when I was working on my developing the 11 principles and some of the, my lock-in, lock-out analysis, it can seem very managerial. And probably when I was developing, I was locked in sort of, I'm from the culture of state-centered systems. I worked in the US government, I worked at the North American level. And more, I'm attracted by place-based governance systems, like I know you are, Michelle, and
yeah,
and I think so there was a question about, do we have to monitor this and manage this, and so
that's
on.
why I was going to come to that question. That's right.
Yeah, well, some of the answers are, let's not feel like we're boxed into that big interlinked globalized system of governance and managerialism, and let's look at some of what we're calling in the research project I'm involved with now, territories of life. And this is framing I just find so compelling. And a lot of the work that we're doing is with indigenous and local communities, where there are long established systems of law or legal traditions that we might not recognize as law, much as colonial explorers did not recognize as law, and they imposed their own under the doctrine of discovery and something. But there are ways for communities to govern themselves that are much more in tune with the earth, that are much more sustainable. So the lessons we have to learn about what we look after, I think, are coming from these place-based traditions. And I see these in the rights of nature movement, where we see that the Whanganui River, a fascinating new hybrid, where for the New Zealand government and the colonial government, that makes sense if you call it legal personhood for nature. For the Maori iwi, this is putting our worldview in practice. We are the river is us. The river is one living being from the mountains to the sea. And so the question of this, from this framing, territories of life, that I find so compelling, and it's a long game question, is why should there be any place on earth that we don't consider a territory of life? And how can we build on what is there? And a lot of those are under threat now, and answer that question in the way that it ethically needs to be answered, as we need to frame the entire earth under that kind of a mindset. So it's the indigenous examples, it's sort of the Ostrom governance examples, which are also very place-based. It's some of these human inclusive rewilding experiments that are going on in Europe, for example, in the Scottish Highlands, where it's not getting rid of humans. It's not sort of this romantic wilderness, move people out, that we use for national parks in many parts of the world, very racist in many cases, very colonial, but it's reintegrating humans in place in a way that's manageable. And we have to keep in mind, this is all happening with an energy transition that has to happen. if the Earth is to remain survivable. You put all those together, and you've got some, I think, hopeful beacon to work towards.
No, thank you, Geoff. Katie and Carla, did you have any thoughts on, and I loop in these two very important questions people have asked, does this kind of approach, ecological law, require heaps of monitoring and enforcement? And, and somebody else, Neil, asked, is this putting too much pressure on elected officials? And I think this links to exactly what Geoff's picked up and what I think Katie spoke to as well. It's not all about state-centered everything. And in fact, last night we had a wonderful discussion as part of Earth Laws Month with Tim Hollow, who's released a book called Living Democracy. And he said in Australia, and I agreed, we've got governance systems with our government that are still deeply colonial and state-centered, and they forget the little folks like us, me, in my community and what we do. So I think this place-based emphasis, but back to you, Katie, I have such long questions, I apologize. When you see all of these emerging ideas, I mean, what do you think about, how do they fit together, or do they not fit together? Or is it just a wonderful example of the bubbling up of what we already knew?
Yeah. Well, what I'm seeing now, just a little bit more targeted to the managerial question, there's certain things we know are not working, and there's certain trends that are taking place even now. So with procedural rights, participatory rights, because if you're talking about place-based governance, you're also understanding those places are within larger places and within larger places and within larger places. So there's hierarchical notions, there's patriarchal notions, there's paternalistic. I mean, let's talk about the Commonwealth here. There's paternalistic notions. Oh yeah, baby, exactly. This is why she's my friend. But what we're seeing that's being very worrying for me is that principles of participatory rights, like, so if a development project is coming into an area with Indigenous people, and so they're going to be affected by it in some way, what governments are now saying is there's a right of consultation, right? What does that mean? Nothing. It literally means nothing. It's a procedural check mark. It's the EIA that we've done, but we don't have to follow the substantive conclusion of the EIA. So you see more and more states now pushing right of consultation. We're democratic, right? We're consulting with these communities. But what we saw in the Chile Constitution that was rejected, and in large part because the mining industry was specifically against it, was right of consent, right of consent. And you'd think if something is going to harm a people, they should be able to veto, have the power to consent for it or against it, right? So it's things like that that are making me very worried about the relationships between these ideas of, oh, we're going to give Indigenous peoples rights, but then it's still limited. It's still within this hierarchy. Yeah,
absolutely. And anyone on this call who's an Australian will just be rolling their eyes in agreement that not only did, in our case, it wasn't until the 1990s we even recognized that the people who lived here since time immemorial had their own governance and legal system. I mean, the horrors of our colonial system go on. But in terms of, so perhaps because I am aware of the time and I know that you guys are really busy and it is nighttime.
I love all of this though, to get to your original question. It's all connected.
It's all connected. It's all connected. And Carla, did you want to comment on, like, you've got these really very helpful 3 principles. How do you see all of this messiness of life fitting in? Do you think they're all going to evolve over time even further back to our ancient understandings that we're just earthlings?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that it's all related, and I think that ecological law is definitely not inventing anything. It's as you said, it's restating what we all knew, what Indigenous peoples traditionally, like ancestral knowledge, all knew, and perhaps colonialism and other Western domination systems have been able to silence or put aside temporarily. But so I really think that ecological law has a lot to learn and grow from all these other things that you've listed there. And in some cases, I would say, for example, rights of nature are an example of ecological law. And I particularly echoing some of what's been said already, I'm not too keen on rights on a rights-based system. I think I much prefer an emphasis on obligations and responsibilities, and I think the other thing that I wanted just to add about ecological law that I think is distinctive, perhaps that is unique, is this, and this is very much thanks to Geoff, I think, this focus on challenging the growth paradigm, challenging this is an immediate objective, an immediate urgent need that ecological law, or any law that wants to help us transition to a livable planet or avoid the ecological collapse, is one of the things that this kind of law has to do immediately. Challenge and stop this madness of endless growth and accumulation and destruction. So I'll leave it at that.
No, and I'm just listening and nodding whilst also replying to Katie's comment. Oh, I love modern life. We're all a little bit crazy, aren't we? Rights-based approaches, Katie says, were also what was used to divide the relational thinking of American Indigenous tribes. And I've put, yes, rights-based approaches are described as adversarial by many Indigenous elders in Australia. The idea that if you've got rights and I've got rights, and I often pose this to rights of nature advocates, if we're starting to recognize the rights of all these different rivers and all the ecosystems then suddenly have rights, then how do we handle that? So AILA is absolutely interested in all of those emerging ideas, but we're really focusing on the relationist ethos as articulated by Indigenous elders in this country, and absolutely not appropriate to call out we're not Indigenous. Well, I'm not. We've got to challenge colonialism, but we have to have earth-centered thinking and governance and feeling and love. So this is the challenge for all of us. And perhaps that's a lovely note to wrap up on. I know that the four of us could keep yarning for ages and we had a few more questions, but I hope that we've spoken to a couple of these ideas. And perhaps the simple way to sum up is ecological law is becoming a handy way to try to group together the essence of the problems in the current system and the directions we really must move in now, without appropriating Indigenous cultures and the ancient wisdom of other places, but really trying to get back to some of that. And I feel it's been an absolute privilege to watch for 10 years the emergence of all these ideas. And when I did my little Daggy umbrella, I thought, I wonder what's going to happen next, because this is not, we often think we're at the point where this is what's happening. It's like, no, we're on a journey out of colonialism and out of controlling and extracting into something else. Do we have time to do it? I don't know. Do we have a choice? No, we don't. We have to keep doing this work. So power to all of you, lovely humans in your various parts of the world. And thank you to everybody for joining us today for this incredible session. So lovely to chat with you all. And we will put this recording on the AILA website. And what's nifty about Earth Laws Month is we've had an update from folks who pioneered the rights of nature. We've got updates from Indigenous folks about what needs to happen next. And we've got these discussions. And then next week, we're going to have more updates about rights of nature and earth-centered governance. So when we put those webinars together, I think it's going to be very useful for all of us to be able to reflect on where everyone's up to and what the heck we can do next. So yeah, but any other final comments from our lovely speakers, Katie, Carla, or Geoff?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're here. If you need emails, contact Michelle. We're here for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Glad to join you. I just want to say I wrote a chapter called our chapter in a book called Our Rights of Nature Radical Enough for Ecological Law. So that sort of tells you what I am.
I like a
in another presentation, I'll show you my a slide I have with all it's the peaceable kingdom. If you know that painting, it's animals and people and everybody's thinking, what are my rights? Who can I sue? My understanding. It really captures that idea that it's ultimately an anthropocentric concept. It comes from Western anthropocentric law. And so
where are we going with it? Yeah, awesome. Very important. Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. Thank you to everyone in the group.
Good to be with you all.
I'll see you lovely people early tomorrow morning for our Elga chat.
Yes, bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Stay in touch.
Bye, everybody.